Washington. Hope y'all can hear me. Booker T. Washington. Booker to Lil Farrell, Washington, April 5th, 1856. November 14th, 1915, was an American educator, author, orator, and advisor to several presidents of the United States between 1890 and 1915. Washington was the dominant leader in the African American community and a contemporary black elite. Washington was from the last generation of black American leaders born into slavery and became the leading voice of the former slave and their descendants. They were newly oppressed in the South by disenfranchisement and the Jim Crow discriminatory laws enacted in the post-Reconstruction Southern states in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Washington was the key proponent of the African American business and one of the founders of the National Negro Business League. His base was the Tuskegee Institution and Normal School, later a historical black college in Tuskegee, Alabama, at which he served as principal as lynchings in the South reached its peak in 1895. Washington gave a speech known as the Atlanta Compromise, which brought him national fame. He called for black progress through education and entrepreneurship rather than trying to challenge directly the Jim Crow segregation of disenfranchisement of the black voters in the South. Washington mobilized the nationwide coalition and middle-class blackouts, church leaders and white philanthropists and politicians with long-term goals of building the community economic strength and pride by focus on self-helping and schooling. With his own contributions to the black community, Washington was the supporter of the racial uplift, but secretly he was also supported court challenges to segregation and to restrictions on voters' registration. Washington had the ear of the power of the American in his day included presidents. His mastery of the American politician. Washington had the ear of the powerful in the America in his day, including the president. His mastery of the American political system in the later 19th century allowed him to manipulate the media, raise money, develop strategies, network, distribute funds, and reward the crowd of supporters. Nevertheless, opposition to the Washington crew, as it became clear that his Atlanta Compromise did not produce the promised empowerment for the blacks in the South. William Moore Trotter and W.E. Du Bois, both votaries received in the antebellum ways as the northern blacks found Washington too accommodationist and his industrialist, agricultural, and mechanical education inadequate. Washington fought vigorously against them and succeeded in his opposition to the Niagara movement. They tried to find, but they could not prevent the formation of the NAACP. Those views became mainstream, you see. Black activists in the northern, led by W.E. Du Bois, at the first supported by the Atlanta Compromise, but later disagreed and opted to set up the new National Association for Advancement of the Colored People, the NAACP, to work over the politicians of change, National Cambu. They tried to limit the success, to challenge Washington's political machine for leadership in the black community, but built wider networks among white allies in the northern decades after Washington's death in 1915 and civil rights movements in 1950 took a more active and progressive approach with the also basis of the new grassroots organization based in the South, such as the Congress of the Racial Equality Corps, the Student Nonviolent Coordinated Committee, SNCC, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Washington's legacy had been controversial in the civil rights community. After his death in 1915, you see, he became under heavy criticism for accommodation to white supremacy, despite his claims that Washington's legacy had been controversial in the civil rights community. After his death in 1915, he came under heavy criticism for accommodationism to white supremacy, despite his claims that his long-term goal was to end the disenfranchisement of the African American, the vast majority of whom still lived in the South, however, were more neutral, viewed and appeared since the late 20th century as of 2010. Most recent studies defend and celebrate his achievements from within, legacy and leadership. Overall view, a little history tip. Born Washington Telephero, Washington, April 5th, 1856. Haynes Fort, Virginia, USA. Died November 14th, 1915. Age 59. Damn, he was young. Tuskegee, Alabama. Resting place, Tuskegee University. Alameda, Hampton. Normal. Agricultural Institute. Wayland Seminary. Occupation, educator. Author. African American civil rights leader. Political party, Republican. Spouses, Fannie N. Smith, Olivia A. Davidson, Margaret Murray. 3 children. Tight signature, small, long, all spelled out. Booker T. Washington. Overview. 1856, Washington was born into slavery in Virginia as the son of Jane, an African-American slave. After emancipation, she moved the family to West Virginia to join her husband, Washington Fergus. West Virginia had seceded from Virginia and joined the Union as a free state. During the Civil War, as a young man, Booker T. Washington worked on his way. Hampton Normal, an agricultural institution, a historical black college, now called Hampton University. At attending college at Wayland Seminary, now Virginia Union University. In 1881, the young Washington was named the first leader of the Tuskegee Institute, an Alabama founder of the highest educations of blacks. He developed the college from the ground up, enlisted students and constructions of the buildings from the classes and the dormitories. Work at the college was considered fundamental to the students' larger education. You gotta build a nation. They maintained a large farm, an essential self-supporting rearing animals and cultivating needs and produce. Washington continued to expand the school. He attained national prominence for his Atlanta address in 1893, which attracted the attention of politicians, you see, and the public. He became a popular spokesman for the African American citizen. He built a nationwide network of supporters in many black communities, with black ministers, educations, and businessmen composing up his core supporters. Washington played a dominant role in the black politics, winning wide support in the black community of the South and among the liberal whites, especially rich northern whites. He gained access to the top national leaders in politics, philanthropy, and education. Washington's efforts included cooperating with the white people and enlisting the support of wealthy philanthropists. Washington had asserted that the surest way for blacks to gain equality, social rights, was to demonstrate industry, thrift, intelligence, and property. Beginning in 1912, he developed a relationship with philanthropist Julius Roswell, the owner of Sears Roebuck, who served on the board of the trustees for the rest of his life and made subsequent donations to Tuskegee. In addition to collaborating with a pilot program, Tuskegee architects, they designed 6 model schools. African American students in rural areas of the South, such schools were historically unfunded by the state and the local government. Given their success in 1913 and 1914, Roswell established the Roswell Foundation in 1917 to aid schools across the nation. It provided matching funds to communities that committed to operate the schools in the construction and maintain the schools with the cooperation of the white public school boards required. Nearly 5,000 new small rural schools were built for black students throughout the South. Most after Washington's death in 1915, Northern critics called Washington's widespread and powerful organization the Tuskegee Machine. After 1909, Washington was criticized by the leaders of the new NAACP, especially the one W.E. Du Bois, who demanded a stronger tone of protest in order to advance the one on the civil rights agenda. Washington repelled and confrontation would lead to the disaster of the outnumbering of blacks in society, and that cooperation with support of whites was the only way to overcome pervasive racism in the long run, you see. At the same time, he secretly founded close terms with National Republican Party leaders. He was often asked for the political advice of Presidents Theodore Roosevelt, you can come to me too, and William Howard Taft, in the addition of his contributions to the education of Washington wrote 14 books in his autobiography, Up From Slavery, published in 1901. He's still widely read today. During the difficult periods of transition, he did much to prove and put the working relationship between the races and the great helps the blacks to achieve education, financial power, and understanding of this U.S. legal system. It's contributed to blacks attaining the skills to create and support the civil rights movement, leading to the passage of the later 20th century of the important federal rights law acts. Early life of Booker. Booker was born into slavery to Jane, an enslaved African American woman on a plantation of Jamesboro in southwest Virginia, near Haley-Board in Franklin County. He never knew the day, the month, or the year of his birth, although evidence emerged after his death that he was born on April 5th, 1856. Nor did he ever know his father, said to be a white man who resided on the neighboring plantation. The man played no financial or emotional role in Washington's life. From his early years, Washington was known as simply as Booker, with no middle or surname. In the practice of the time, his mother, her relatives, and his siblings struggled with the demands of slavery. He later wrote, "I cannot remember a single instance during my childhood or early boyhood when our entire family sat down at the table together and God bless it was asked and the family ate a meal in a civilized manner on the plantation in Virginia, and even later meals were gotten to the children very much as dumb animals got theirs. It was a piece of bread here, a scrap of meat there, a cup of milk at one time, and some potatoes at another. When he was 9, Booker and his family in Virginia gained freedom from the Emancipation Proclamation as the U.S. troops occupied their region. Booker was thrilled by the informal day of their emancipation in the early 1865. As the great news and the great day drew near, there was more singing in the slavery quarters than usual. It was bolder, had more ring to it. and it lasted later into the night. Most of the verses on the plantation songs had some reference to freedom. Some man had seemed to be a stranger, and the United States officer, I presume, made a little speech and then read a rather long paper, the Emancipation Proclamation. I think after the reading we were told that we were all free, which she had been so long praying for, but fearing that she would never live to see it. Black president. After emancipation, Jane took her family and free state up to West Virginia to join her husband, Washington Fergus, who had escaped from slavery during the war and settled there. The illiterate boy Booker began to painstakingly teach himself to read and attend school for the first time. At school, Booker was asked for the sure name he registered. He took the family name of Washington after his stepfather. Still later, he learned that his mother, that she had originally given him the name Booker Telephero at the time of his birth, but his second name was not used by the master. Upon learning of his original name, Washington immediately redopted it and made it his own, and became known as Booker Telephero Washington for the rest of his life. Booker loved books, the Negro worship books, Booker worship books. The fuck was that shit? He wanted books, more books. The larger the books were, the better he liked them. He thought they were mere possessions and were mere handling of the mere worship of books, and was going in some inexplicable way to make great, strong, and useful men out of our race. Higher education. Washington worked in salt furnace and in the coal mines in West Virginia. For several years to earn money, he made his way east to Hampton Institute, a school established in Virginia to educate freed men and their descendants, where he also worked to pay for his studies, his tuition. He later attended Wayland Seminary in D.C., Tuskegee Institute in 1881. The Hampton Institute president Samuel C. Armstrong recommended Washington, then age 25, to become the first leader at the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute. Later, Tuskegee Institute, now known as Tuskegee University. The new normal school teachers college in Alabama. The new school opened in July 4th, 1881. Another reason to celebrate the 4th. Initially using a room dedicated by Butler Chapel AME Zion Church. The next year, Washington purchased the former plantation to be developed as the permanent site of the campus. We see, under his direction, the students literally, let's keep changing, we can't put them on repeat. The next year, Washington purchased the former plantation to be developed as the permanent site on the campus. Under his direction, his students literally built their own school, making bricks and constructing classrooms, barns, and outbuildings, and growing their own crops and raising livestock, both learning and providing the most basic necessities. Both men and women had to learn trades as well as academics. The Tuskegee facility used all the activities to teach the students basic skills and take back their own mostly rural black communities through the south of the hills. And main goals was not to produce farmers and tradesmen, but teachers of farmers and tradesmen who could teach the new lower school schools and colleges for blacks across the South. The school expanded over the decades, adding programs and departments to become the present-day Tuskegee University. The Oaks in the large comfort home was built on the campus of the Washington, and his family, they moved into the house in 1900. Washington lived there until his death in 1915. His widow Margaret lived in the Oaks until her death in 1925. Later years, later career. Later years. Washington led Tuskegee for more than 30 years after becoming its leader, its king. As he developed it, adding to both the curriculum and the facilities of the campus, he became a prominent national leader of African Americans. He was a king among African Americans with considerable influence and wealth. White philanthropists and politicians. Washington expressed his vision for his race through the school. He believed that by providing needed skills to society, African Americans would play their part, leading to acceptance by white America. He believed that blacks would eventually gain full participation in society by acting as responsible and reliable American citizens. Shortly after the Spanish-American War, President William McKinley and most of his cabinet visited Booker Washington. By his death in 1915, Tuskegee had grown to encompass more than 100 well-equipped buildings, roughly 1,500 students, 200 faculty members, teaching 38 trades and professions, and empowering approximately $2 million, an endowment of approximately $2 million. Washington helped develop other schools and colleges. In 1891, he lobbied in the West Virginia legislature to locate a newly authorized West Virginia Colored Institution, today West Virginia State University, in Kanawha Valley of West Virginia, near Charleston. He visited the campus often and spoke at its first commencement exercises. Washington was a dominant figure in the African American community. He was a king, then still overwhelmed, based in the South from 1890 to his death in 1915. His Atlanta address in 1895 received national acclaim and attention. He was considered as a popular spokesman for the African American citizen, representing the last generation of black leaders born into slavery. Washington was generally perceived as a supporter of education for free men and their descendants in the post-Reconstruction Jim Crow era South. He stressed basic education and training in manual and domestic labor trades because he thought these represented the skills needed in what was still a rural economy. Throughout the final 20 years of his life, he maintained his standings through the nationwide network of supporters, including black educators, ministers, editors, and businessmen, especially those who supported his views on social and educational issues for blacks. He was gained access to top national white leaders and politicians in politics and philanthropists and educations, raised large sums of monies, was consulted on race issues, and was awarded honorary degrees from Harvard University in 1896 and Dartmouth College in 1901. Later in his career, Washington was criticized by civil rights leaders from the NAACP, and his supporters opposed the Atlanta Address as the Atlanta Compromise because it suggested that African Americans should work for and submit to white political rule. Du Bois insisted on full civil rights, due process for law, and increased political representation for African Americans, which he believed could only be achieved through activism and higher education for the African American. He believed that the talented 10th would lead the race. DuBois labeled Washington the Great Accommodator. Washington responded that confrontation could lead to disaster for the outnumbered blacks, and that cooperation with supportive whites was the only way to overcome racism in the long run. While promoting moderation, Washington contributed secretly and substantially to mounting legal challenges. Activists, African Americans launched against segregation and disenfranchisement of blacks. In his public role, he believed he could achieve more by skillful accommodations to the social realities of the age of segregation. I really don't like you. In his role, he believed he could achieve more by skillful accommodation to the social realities of the age of segregation. Washington's work on education helped him enlist both the moral and the substantial financial support of many whites philanthropists. He became a friend of such self-made men of Standard Oil, magnate Henry Hustle Rogers, Sears Roebuck, the company, President Julius Roswell, and George Eastman, inventor of the Roll film, founder of the Eastman Kodiak, and developer of the major parts of the photographic industry. These individuals and many other wealthy men and women founded his cause. So understand, this has been done before, people. When I come knocking at your door, Mark. When I come knocking at your door, Elon. Let's be friends. He also gave lectures to raise money for the schools. On January 23rd, 1906, he lectured at Carnegie Hall in New York in the Tuskegee Institute Silver Anniversary Lecture. He spoke along with great orators of the day, including Mark Twain and Joseph Hodgins Coad and Rupert Curtis Hodgins. It was the start of the capital campaign to raise billions upon billions of dollars with the nation of Cambodia. Trillions upon trillions of dollars with the nation of Cambodia. The schools with Washington supported were founded primarily to produce teachers as education and critical for black communities following the emancipation. Freedmen strongly supported literacy and education as the keys to their future. When graduates returned to the larger impoverished rural southern communities, they still found few schools and educational resources as white-dominated state legislatures consistently underfunded black schools and the segregated systems. To address those needs in the 20th century, Washington enlisted his philanthropic network to create matching fund programs to stimulate construction of numerous rural schools, and black children in the South worked especially with Julius Roswell from Chicago. Washington had Tuskegee's architects develop modern school designs. The Roswell Fund helped support the construction and operation of more than 5,000 schools and related resources for the education of blacks throughout the South. In the late 19th and 20th centuries, the local schools were a source of communal pride. African American families gave labor, land, and money to them. African American families gave labor, land, and money to them. African American families gave labor, land, and money to them to give their children more chances in the environment of poverty and segregation. A major part of Washington's legacy, the model. Rural schools continued to be constructed into the 1930s with matching funds from communities from the Roswell Fund. Washington also contributed to the progressive era by forming the National Negro Business League. It encouraged entrepreneurship among black businessmen, establishing a nationwide network. His autobiography, Up From Slavery, first published in 1901, is still widely read in the early 21st century. Marriage and children. Washington was married 3 times. In his autobiography, Up From Slavery, he gave all 3 of his wives credit for their contributions at Tuskegee. His first wife, Fannie M. Smith, was from Maiden, West Virginia, the same Kanawha River Valley town where Washington had lived from the age of 9 to 16. He maintained ties there for all of his life, and Smith was a student of his when he taught in Maiden. He helped her gain entrance into Hampton Institution. Washington and Smith were married in the summer of 1882, a year after he became principal there. They had 1 child, Porter M. Washington, born in 1883. Fannie died in May of 84. In 85, the widower Washington married again to Olivia A. Davidson. 1854 to 1889, born free in Virginia, a free woman of color, and a father who had been freed from slavery. She moved with her family in the free state of Ohio, where she attained common school. Davidson later studied at Hampton Institution and went north to study with Massachusetts State Normal School Furman. She taught in Mississippi and Tennessee before going to Tuskegee to work as a teacher. Washington recruited Davidson to Tuskegee and promoted her to vice principal and had 2 sons. They had 2 sons, Booker T. Washington Jr. and Ernest Davidson Washington. Before she died in 1889, in 1893, Washington married Margaret James Murray. She was from Mississippi and had graduated from Fisk University, a historical black college. They had no children together, but she helped rear Washington's 3 children. Murray outlived Washington and died 15 years later in 1925. Politics in the Atlantic Compromise. Let's start this one here This damn fly is bothering me. Politics in the Atlantic Compromise. Washington in 1895 Atlanta Expedition address was viewed as the revolutionary movement by both African Americans and whites across the country. At a few times, W.E. Du Bois supported him, but they grew apart as W. Du Bois sought more action, a remedy for the disenfranchised and the improvement in the education opportunities for blacks. After their fallout, Du Bois and his supporters referred to Washington's speech as the Atlanta Compromise to express their criticism that Washington was too accommodating to white interests. Washington advocated to go slow approach to avoid a harsh white backlash. He had been criticized for encouraging many youths in the South to accept sacrifice of potential political power, civil rights, and higher education. Washington believed that African Americans should concentrate all their energies on industrial education and accumulation of wealth and the consolidation in the South. He valued the industrial education as it provided critical skills for the jobs then available to the majority of African Americans at the time, which most lived in the South, which was overwhelming rural and agricultural. He thought these skills would lay the foundation for the creation of the stability of the African American community required in order to move forward. He believed that the long-term blacks would eventually gain full participation in society by showing themselves to be responsible, reliable American citizens. His approach advocated for the initial step forward towards equal rights rather than full equality under the law, gain economic power to back up black demands for political equity in the future, you see. He believed that such achievements would prove to be deeply prejudiced. White America and African Americans were not naturally stupid. And incompetent, while educated blacks in the North lived in a different society and advocated a different approach, in part due to their perception of the wider opportunity. D.W.D. Du Bois wanted blacks to have the same classical liberal arts education as the upper class whites did. Of course he did, and I would too, along with the voter rights and civil equity. And later too, he had been obstinately granted since 1870 by the constitutional amendment after the Civil War, you see. He believed that the elite were, he called the talented 10, would advance the lead, the race, and the wider variety of occupations. Du Bois and Washington were divided in part by differences, too bad, in treatment of the African Americans in the North versus the South. Couldn't see eye to eye, that's okay. We're reading the story here today. It's called Learning. Although both groups were suffering discrimination, the masses of blacks in the South were far more constrained with the legal segregation and disenfranchisement, which totally excluded most of them from politics, political process, and system. Many of them northern objections to be led and authorized spoke by the southern economists. Strategy, which they considered to have been imposed on them by southern black, primarily by southern whites. Historian Clarence E. Walker wrote that for the southern white men, free black people were a matter out of place. Their emancipation was an affront to the southern white freedom race. Booker T. Washington did not understand that his program was perceived as subversive of the nature of order in which black people were to remain forever subordinate or unfree. Both Washington and Du Bois sought to define their best means post-Civil War to improve the conditions of the African American community through education. Blacks were solidly Republican, you see, in the period. One more time. At your own risk. Having gained emancipation and suffrage from President Lincoln and his party, fellow Republican presidents Ulysses Grant defended African Americans' newly won freedom in the Civil War. The South was passing laws and using federal force to suppress the Ku Klux Klan, which had committed violence against blacks for years to suppress the voting and discourage education. After federal troops left the nation in 1877 at the end of the Reconstruction era, many parliamentary groups worked to suppress black voting by violence. From the 1890s to 1908, 7 states disenfranchised disenfranchised most blacks and many poor whites through constitutional amendments and statutes that created barriers to register to vote and voting rights, such as devices and poll taxes and subject literacy tests, sharply reduced the number of blacks in voting rolls. By the late 19th century, Southern white Democrats defeated some parochial populist Republican coalitions and regained power in the state legislatures of the former Confederacy. They passed laws establishing racial segregation, you see, and Jim Crow in the border states, and northern blacks continued to exercise the vote. And well-established Maryland African-American communities defeated attempts there to disfranchise them. Washington worked on socialized and many national white politicians and industrial leaders. He developed the ability to persuade wealthy whites, many of them self-made men, to donate money in black causes. By appealing to their values, he argued that the surest way for blacks to gain equal social rights was to demonstrate industry, thrift, intelligence, and property. He believed that this was the way, the key to improve conditions in the African American cities in the United States, because African Americans have recently been emancipated and most lived in the hostile environment. Washington believed that he could not export too much at once. He said, "I have to learn that success is to be measured not so much by the position that one has reached in life, but by the obstacles which one has to overcome while trying to succeed." Although Du Bois, Washington partly organized the Negro Expedition in 1900, Expedition Universelle in Paris, where photos of Hampton's Institute's black students were displayed. They were taken by his friend Francis Benjamin Johnston to the expedition, demonstrated African American positive contributions to the United States society. Washington, we built that fucking society. Washington privately contributed substantial funds for legal challenges to segregation and disenfranchisement, such as the case of Hills v. and Harris, which was heard before the United States Supreme Court in 1903. Even with such challenges we won at the Supreme Court level, Southern states quickly responded with new laws to accomplish the same ends. For instance, adding grandfather clauses in that covered whites and not blacks in order to prevent blacks from voting. To this day, wealthy friends and benefactors. Wealthy friends and benefactors. Last section, yo. State the local government, historical underfunded black schools, although they were unsustainable, providing separate but equal segregated facilities. White philanthropists strongly supported education, you see, financially, and Washington encouraged them as directed millions of their monies to projects all across the South that Washington thought best reflected his self-help philosophy. Washington associated with the richest and the most powerful of businessmen and politicians of his era. He was seen as the spokesman for the African American and became the conduit for funding educations and programs. His contacts included such diverse and well-known entrepreneurs and philanthropists such as Andrew Carnegie, William Howard Taft, John D. Rockefeller, Henry Hossinger Rogers, George Eastman, Julius Roswell, Robert Curtis, Odins, Collins Porter Huntingtons, and William Henry Baldwin Jr. The later donated large sums of money to agencies such as the Jeans and the Slaughter Funds. As a result, countless small rural schools were established through Washington's effort to underprogram would continue many years after his death. After a rich white man, the black communities helped the communities directly by donating time, money, and labor to the schools to match the funds required. Henry Rogers, a representative case of the exceptional relationship with Washington's friendship with the millionaire, industrialist, and financier Henry H. Rogers in 1840 to 1909. Henry Rogers was a self-made man who had risen to a modest working-class family to become a principal officer of Standard Oil and one of the richest men in the United States. Around 1894, Rogers heard Washington speak at Madison Square Garden. The next day, he contacted Washington and requested a meeting, during which Washington later recounted that he was told that Rogers was surprised that no one had passed that hat after the speech. The meeting began a close relationship that extended over a period of 15 years. Seasons. Although Washington and his very private Rogers were seen as friends, the true depth of the scope of their relationship was not publicly revealed until after Rogers' sudden death from a stroke. In 1909, Washington was a frequent guest at Rogers' New York City office, his Fairhaven, Massachusetts summer home, and aboard his steam yacht, Kanawha. A few weeks later, Washington went on a previously planned speaking tour, along with newly completed Virginian Railroad, a $40 million enterprise that had been built almost entirely from Rogers' personal fortune. As Washington rode in the late financier's private rail car, Dixie, he stopped and made speeches at various locations. His companions later recounted that he had been very warmly welcomed by both black and white citizens at each stop. Washington revealed that Rogers had been quietly funding operations of 65 small country schools for African Americans and had given substantial sums of money to support Tuskegee, the Hampton Institute. He also noted that Rogers had encouraged programs with matching funds requirements such as recipients had a stake in the income. Anna T. Jeans, in 1907, Philadelphia Quaker Ann T. Jeans, 1822 to 1907, donated $1 million to Washington for elementary schools for black children in the South. Their contributions and those of Henry Rogers and other founded schools in many of the poor communities. Julius Roswell, 1862, 1932, was another self-made black man with whom Washington found common ground. By 1908, Roswell's son of an immigrant clothier had become owner of the president of Sears Roebuck Company in Chicago. Roswell was a philanthropist who was deeply concerned about the poor state of the African American, especially in the segregated southern states, where schools were underfunded. In 1912, Roswell was asked to serve on the board of directors of the Tuskegee Institution, a position he held for the remainder of his life. Roswell's endowment, Tuskegee, so that Washington could spend less time fundraising and more managing the school. Later in 1912, Roswell provided funds to Tuskegee for a pilot program to build 6 new small schools in rural Alabama. They were designed, constructed, and opened in 1913 and 1914 and overseen by Tuskegee architects and staff. The model proved successful. After Washington died in 1915, Roswell established the Roswell Fund in 1917, primarily to serve African American students in rural areas throughout the South. The school building program was one of the largest programs used in the architectural model plans developed by the professors at Tuskegee Institute. The Roswell Fund spent over $4 million to help build almost 5,000 schools, over 200 teachers, homes, and 163 shops, buildings in 883 counties and 15 states, from Maryland to Texas. The Roswell Fund made matching grants requiring community support, cooperation from the white school boards, and local fundraising. Black communities raised more than $4.7 million to aid in the construction, and sometimes donated land and labor. Essentially, they taxed themselves twice to do so. These schools became informally known as Roswell schools, but the philanthropists did not want them named after him, as they belonged to their communities. By his death in 1932, these newer facilities could accommodate 1/3 of all African American children in southern U.S. schools. Up from slavery. generation of Black American leaders born into slavery and became the leading voice of the former slave and their descendants. They were newly oppressed in the South by disenfranchisement and the Jim Crow discriminatory laws enacted in the post-Reconstruction Southern states in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Washington was the key proponent of the African American business and one of the founders of the National Negro Business League. His base was the Tuskegee Institution and Normal School, later a historical black college in Tuskegee, Alabama, at which he served as principal. As lynchings in the South reached its peak in 1895, Washington gave a speech known as the Atlanta Compromise, which brought him national fame. He called for black progress through education and entrepreneurship rather than trying to challenge directly the Jim Crow segregation of disenfranchisement of the black voters in the South. Washington mobilized a nationwide coalition of middle-class blackouts, church leaders and white philanthropists and politicians with long-term goals of building the community economic strength and pride by focus on self-helping and schooling. With his own contributions to the black community, Washington was the supporter of the racial uplift, but secretly he was also supporting court challenges to segregation and to restrictions on voters' registration. Washington had the ear of the power of America, and in his day included presidents. His mastery of the American politician. Washington had the ear of the powerful in the America in his day, including the president. His mastery of the American political system in the later 19th century allowed him to manipulate the media, raise money, develop strategies, network, distribute funds, and reward the crowd of supporters. Nevertheless, opposition to the Washington